It's currently midnight, and this all went down about 45 minutes ago. My brother decided to make a late night run to the grocery store, but on his way back his tire exploded, so he called my dad to come pick him up from the gas station that he managed to pull into. There are some sketchy folk around that area, so my dad suggested we just change the tire and escort him home to make sure that some donut didn't go flat too, because it's fairly old. My dad calls me and asks me to bring me tools and a jack so we can change the tire. After the donut is on, my dad goes in front and my brother follows, and of course, I follow behind my brother. We live on a back road off of a back road. Not many houses, lots of farmland, and not much traffic, with lots of deer at night, so my dad and I turned on our LEDs that we use when we go off-roading, when we go to our roads so we could see deer well before they were a hazard. The fields stretch about a quarter mile from the road on either side, and the lights are bright enough so that I can just barely see the tree line past the fields. We get up to a bend in the road where a small patch of woods separates the field from the house beside it, and I see glowing eyes to my left about 15 feet away from the patch of woods on the field side. There were lots of deer out, so I was already on high alert. I slowed down and kept an eye on it. This thing, whatever I was looking at, had arms. It had a humanoid shape, a humanoid head. It was not far from the road, so it was lit up pretty bright. I have no doubts in my mind about what I saw. I was going about 15 miles an hour. It wasn't just a quick glimpse either. I looked at it for at least 30 seconds before it was out of view. Once I realized that I had never seen anything like what I was seeing, I started honking my horn and pointing so that my brother and dad in front of me would look. But by then they had already passed by the patch of woods and could not see it. I would guess it was maybe around 6 to 7 feet tall when standing, but it appeared to be either hunched over or kneeling on the ground. It was resting one elbow on something, and the other arm was straight. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Nosferatu, but its head and face looked very similar to Nosferatu's. It looked gaunt and pale, and even had pointed ears and glowing eyes. I'm sure the glow was because of the lumens I was shining at it, but at the least it tells me it's a nocturnal living creature. I live in North Carolina if that helps anyone in figuring out what this is. I'm very concerned because it wasn't far away from my home, and I've been hearing very strange noises at night the past few weeks. I took my puppy out to use the bathroom yesterday around 10 p.m. and I could hear something in the forest walking very slow. I know it wasn't a deer because the puppy was barking and it didn't run off. I didn't have a flashlight, so I just kept my gun out in case it was a predator and it tried to eat my puppy. It was snapping big sticks and it sounded heavy. I'm convinced it wasn't a bear because we don't live in bear country. We've never seen any bear around here and we go into the woods a lot. We also have a chain link fence all the way around our property line, including in the woods. We inspect it often and I walked the perimeter today and none of it was damaged. Whatever this is, it's agile and smart enough to climb and jump over a fence without noticeably damaging it. A few months ago, I also noticed a lot of scratches on the trees around my house. They were all no less than 7 foot off the ground, so in my mind that took a mountain lion out of the equation. If anyone finds this description familiar, please let me know. I'm fishing down at Catagon. It's on the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania. So I parked at the top ramp going down to the river. Not a boat ramp, just one for backing 4-wheels down to the water. I go up and it's getting to be just about twilight when I could hear something coming down the hillside across from us. It's steep, but not too steep. Anyway, I hear it barreling down the hillside, but the brush is thick and really high. a better part of 12 feet. Now I'm waiting for a black bear to hop on the road, but it doesn't. It just stops in the middle of the last brush right beside the road. Thinking it was still a bear, I go ushering my friend and his 4-year-old daughter back down to the river. There's a bunch of rocks there from a baseball to a basketball size, so they can defend themselves. I'm still up at my car because I'm less than 5 feet from my door, and this brush is a good 30 feet away, so I know I can make it to my car and distract it with my horn and engine. And yet it never leaves the brush, just shakes it violently. I stand there about 5 minutes and I could see it make its way up the hill. I didn't realize it was pushing the trees around. About 20 feet tall, I'm sure I wasn't connecting anything because of my adrenaline. I'd never seen it. It was too dark by that point. I walk back down to the river and we're gathering up our stuff. It's starting to get way too creepy. We start packing up and I could hear a knocking coming from the hillside. I could see a group of people down the river from us, but they aren't near any trees. They're actually on an outcrop about 20 feet away from the tree line. This knocking is above us and slightly upriver, and even they had reacted to it, looking around and whatnot. I yelled to them, possibly being a bear, and they said they heard something coming down the hillside and seen my buddy running towards the water. They thanked us for the heads up. As soon as they thanked us, a rock came flying off the hillside in between us and them. We actually seen the rock hit the water. They jumped, as I did. We really weren't expecting it. I turned around to see if my friend was up on the hill and was messing with us. As I turned, he was just a few feet behind me, holding his daughter, and both were white as ghosts. None of us were expecting that. I decided to reach down and grab a rock and carried it with me just in case it got real. 3 more times we heard these rocks hitting the water, and I had just had enough. Our site was all cleaned, and I took it as perfect time to retaliate. But I knew where they were being thrown from. That damn brush, so I chucked it. I knew there wasn't any trees around, and I figured if I threw it, it would probably just blow right through it. But it didn't. It made a sound like someone who was beating their chest, and it rolled back towards me. I actually heard whatever I hit get the wind knocked out of it, and it hit the hillside. It takes off down the road, towards the other group. They start screaming, and I meant a life being threatened, utter terror scream, and start throwing whatever they could grab at it. I'm just standing there, bewildered and watching them scatter. Few went into the water, and the rest ran towards me. All of a sudden, someone yells, "Get in the truck!" Now they took off to their truck, and I mean it when they said they left everything. Nobody grabbed anything, and they took off. I'll never forget their screams. I ran back up the hill and hopped in my car. My buddy ran up with his daughter right after they started shouting. He was crying, and I've known this man for 20 years, and I could count on one hand how many times I've seen him cry. I start up my car and we high-tailed it out of there. Never seen what it was, but I put everything together later that night. It's been 5 years since it happened, and he absolutely refuses to go down there. Damn shame too, because it's an amazing catfish spot. I am in a part of North Dakota. An unlikely place, I know, but there's this one specific area on the outskirts that I always get a bad vibe from. One day, we were smoking there, and my friend thought he saw something creeping up. I didn't see anything, but from what I heard, it was large and moving very slowly. Everyone in the group booked it out, and one of my friends is native, and he swears he believed it was one. There are a lot of coyote around in that area, so I thought it was probably just that, since I didn't actually see anything. But another day, we were on the outskirts of this spot. It's a good smoke spot, so we were always around there. And in the tree near us, there was a giant owl. It was the first time I've ever seen one here, and for some reason, It gave a really bad vibe, and somehow looked off. That's really the only way I can explain it. The way it stood on the branch, facing away from us, with its head down, and its wing, or something like that, was very dark, so it was kinda hard to see, and we didn't stick around to look very long. So I had no idea, but some of my friends are thoroughly convinced. Ever since then, I found myself strangely drawn to that place, and find myself going there for no reason and sitting. I've heard they can control your mind to an extent, and am wondering if that's not what's going on. Any advice and opinions are welcome, but I'm certain that I did see a skinwalker or something. My grandparents have a cabin in a town in Pennsylvania, south of Scranton. Every summer, we usually go up for a few weeks as a family event. Ever since I was little. A few years ago, we decided to go in the winter because my family wanted to go skiing at some point. After we get there, the weird things start happening really quickly, and seemingly out of nowhere. The house was built in the 1920s, old brick and wooden. The doors are these giant, almost church-looking doors, and the style of home is very medieval, definitely just adding to the creepy vibes of the home. The first night was seemingly calm through the house, but whenever I went there, I always felt that there was something watching me, or something lurking through the halls. The first night I got up to go to the bathroom at around 3:10, which is also interesting, because I never get up to go to the bathroom back at home. Most nights I sleep right through it without ever waking up. There were 8 of us in the house. My 2 parents, my grandparents, my aunt, my uncle, and my male cousins, 2 of them of course. I went to one of the 3 main bathrooms, 4 in the house if you count the master. So when I heard someone was in there, I thought that was interesting, because I was one of the few people who doesn't share the bathroom. But I stood outside, waiting to make sure I did not intrude on anything going on in there, as my one cousin can get quite upset and I didn't want to bother him. What was extremely weird is the fact that whatever was in there didn't sound human in its movements. It dragged its feet around, or so it sounded, which made me nervous that it might be sick. I called out his name a few times. "Drew, are you okay in there? It's been a long time and I want to go to bed," or something along those lines. A few seconds later, he comes out of his bedroom and asks me why I'm making so much noise, tells me he's trying to sleep, and slams the door behind him. Before I could freak out, he had already shut the door, and I was too scared to even yell back to him. I never realized before that the door wasn't even locked in the first place, which made me feel even more uneasy. Between the banter, I never realized that the sounds had stopped, and it didn't seem like anybody was in the bathroom anymore. I still even tell myself this was just my imagination, but I'm not known for sleepwalking or having any type of sleep disorder. I decided to just open the door, brushing it off as my too vivid imagination. When I opened the door, it looked like nothing strange had happened in there. But when I was washing my hands, I realized the window was open, and I froze, thinking somebody had broken into the house. But this was on the 2nd story, with nothing to climb up on, making it almost impossible to climb up there, unless of course you had a ladder, but obviously there was none. The next day, nothing happened in the daytime, making it seem more to me that it was just a figment of my imagination than reality. But that night, I had to let the dog out. She is elderly and never really barks much, nor does she run fast. So this definitely is a case for concern, I thought. When I let her out, she bolted to the edge of the woods and vanished inside of them. I tried to follow her barking, but honestly, I was too scared to go into the woods past the tree line. When I finally got her to walk back, her back legs seemed off, almost like a person pretending to be a dog walking on the ground. Her eyes were also off. They looked human-like, not her usual dark almond eyes. I freaked out and ran back inside without her. When I got inside, she was sitting, panting by the door, so she must have ran back in when I was yelling into the woods to try and find her. At this point, I didn't even want to leave that house, for fear of what was lurking in the woods. I had no previous information on skinwalkers or even knew what they were, so I had not yet connected the dots. The last night we stayed there was the most interesting and confusing turn of events that had happened. We had skied all day, so we went to bed quite early, around 9 to 10. I never fell asleep early, as I am usually a night owl myself. But I woke up around 12 a.m. to the sounds of my cousin Drew yelling outside. I woke up in a fog and tried to quickly rush to the door and open it. I didn't even take into consideration that the door was still locked from the inside. When I got outside, his voice seemed to be coming from multiple directions and echoing throughout the valley. I saw him by the cars, yelling, and when I started to go outside and call his name, he looked at me quickly. His eyes got huge and he ran into the woods, with a beckoning gesture for me to follow. I decided that that was definitely a bad idea, so I woke up his parents and he ended up being asleep in his room the entire time. Not now, until years later, did I even find out about skinwalkers from one of my Native American friends that I met in college. I still have no idea what was out there that weekend, and I haven't been back since. Before I tell my story, I figured I'd give a little backstory, of course. This happened a few years ago when I was living in Arizona in the middle of nowhere. I've since moved to the East Coast where there are no skinwalkers, thank God. I also had 2 German Shepherds and I still have them now. It was probably like the middle of June and sometimes I'd like to sleep with my window open. There was a screen so the window wasn't completely open. As I mentioned above, I have 2 German Shepherds. The older one, named Archer, slept on the floor in the bigger of the 2 dog beds, while the younger one, Nissa, tended to sleep on the bed with me. It had been around 2 in the morning when I jolted awake to the sound of Nissa growling at something outside. I looked around and Archer was nowhere to be found. I could have swore I'd let him back in the house before going to bed, but I was starting to think that I hadn't. I got closer to the window and looked out. I saw, or at least I thought I saw, Archer sitting outside. He is a rather large dog, so he's hard to miss. His appearance seemed a bit off. His back legs were up higher than his front legs, and his face was kind of strange. It was misshapen, and his nose looked longer than usual. I swear he's part wolf or something, so his muzzle is shorter than a normal German Shepherd. Nissa was still raising hell on my bed, so I tried to get her to stop by calling her name. That was the only thing I said in this short time, just a quick, "Nissa!" and I turned back to the window. As I was looking out the window for what had felt like an eternity, having an intense stare down with Archer, I heard something coming back into my room. I turned and I saw Archer, who was looking up at me before he too started to growl outside at the thing. I was so stunned, the only thing that pulled me out of my haze was my own voice saying, "Nissa." Only I hadn't opened my mouth, nor was I speaking. The noise was coming from outside, from that thing that was outside my window. It almost sounded exactly like me, but there was something weird about the voice. It was almost crackly. The only way I can describe it is demonic. Needless to say, it scared me half to death. I slammed the window shut, shooed my dogs out of my room, and locked us in the bathroom until morning. I never had another experience after that, but to this day, I don't sleep with my window open anymore. This happened to my big brother when he was 15. We grew up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. He was coming home from hanging out with a friend, and it was probably around 2, because his curfew was at 11, and my guardian had been up a while. I know this because she was talking to my mom in the kitchen and was super angry and loud, and I stayed up listening to them argue. When he came in, my guardian started to tell him off, but stopped because he was crying and talking in a hysterically frightened tone. Apparently, he came in the back gate and saw a coyote standing propped up on its hind legs against the back door, looking in the window. This wasn't so odd because it was Arizona, but when he came closer, the coyote turned its head to look at him, and as it did, it turned its whole body and started walking toward him on two legs, like a man. My brother swears it looked too big for a coyote as it came at him. He ran back out the gate and came around to the front door. To this day, he still cries talking about it. He's convinced that he encountered a skinwalker watching over our family. I also remember a wicked-looking eagle following me everywhere I went up there. So much so that as a kid, I talked to it and considered it one of my closest friends. And I know it sounds crazy, but as a kid, I remember telling it a really crappy joke I'd love and hearing laughter in my head. It was mid-January, a few years back in New York. I always loved the wintertime because of how cold and snowy everything was, but now I can't shake the feeling that there was more than just woods and snow out in a wintry forest. My family were upstate for the weekend to have some good bonding. I just wanted to explore the forest. I was allowed to go out into the woodland by myself as long as I stuck to the path. I was out there for about 18 minutes before I started noticing something. I looked around curiously to explore the forest's beauty when I noticed a very awkward-looking mound of snow, or at least I thought it was a mound. I looked at it closely, but it was far too far deep into the forest for me to see any real features. I thought nothing of it and decided to go back home. After 2 minutes, I felt I was being watched and kept on looking around me. I convinced myself it was just squirrels and I kept on retreating. I smelled an awful stench to my left, causing me to jolt to my side looking for whatever was out there. That same mound was there again, but it looked like something else. It had these twisted bones extending into the skin and had pale white skin. Under extinct alone, I started booking it back to the house. I heard something chase me from the woods. Luckily for me, I had multiple first place track finishes, and I was running a straight, which in the end allowed me to get back home quickly. I got back into the view of my house and sprinted up to the porch. I looked back into the forest and saw the rustling of leaves coming up to the edge, then nothing. It just stopped and the stench faded away. For some reason, I never told anyone except my two best friends who dismissed it as me messing with them. I hope I can find more answers for whatever it was I saw that day. About 4 years ago, on it's getting dark pretty early fall evening around 7 p.m., my girlfriend and roommate and I were walking along some decommissioned Washington train tracks surrounded by woods on both sides. We love exploring little in-between areas, so this wasn't an uncommon event. We were about 5 miles into the tracks and woods and were considering heading back since it was just getting dark quickly, and none of us had flashlights. I suddenly got the sensation of almost nausea-inducing dread and looked at both my friends who were with me, and saw that they too were feeling something, wide-eyed and looking around. "Let's start heading back," I declare, and they all nod in silent agreement. Mind you, we were doing just fine a second ago, and to do this sort of thing all the time, so this sudden onset of fear was unusual and not something that we were prepared for or used to. Just as we were turned around, we all heard a strange sound that almost sounded like quieted thunder, metal hitting metal, that was coming from what sounded like off in the distance. As we whipped around to see what made the noise, a large white bird that I think was a white owl flew over our heads silently, flapping its wings and disappearing behind a tree that was a good 25 feet behind us. We all looked at each other, trying to make sense of what the hell we all just heard, and then started walking briskly back towards civilization. We heard what sounded like twigs snapping in the woods behind us, and my girlfriend and I turned around to see what made the noise. Peeking from behind the tree, the owl just flew behind, was what looked like an impossibly tall, ghost white, humanoid shape, with one hand on the tree trunk as it peered out from behind it. Before we can get a good look at its face, it quickly retreated back to behind the tree and out of our sight again. My girlfriend and I looked at each other, panicked. She opened her mouth to say something, and I told her, "Don't talk about it, we need to walk faster." My roommate looked at us confused and clearly scared by what I had just said, so I told him we need to probably run home at this point, which we did. I've told a few people this story, and honestly, no one believes me. What I saw was not the owl I had seen earlier. This being had a clear ghost white hand on the tree trunk, a neck and an upper body, and was tall. I'd say like 7 feet at least. Not tall enough to reach the branches of the tree though. I wish I could have made out the face. It was just so dark that the only reason I could see it was because of how white it was. First off, here's a little information about my backyard. It's pretty long and connects to an alleyway, and all the way at the back we have 2 poles that have been used for hanging clothes out to dry. They're probably about 6.5 feet tall. Connecting to my house in the yard is a porch. It's basically a room with 2 of the walls taken out and replaced with wire mesh. And now to the actual story. We live in a 2-bedroom house with me, my cousin, her son, my mom, and my grandfather. Me and my mom used to share a room until my cousin got pregnant, so she gave up our room so she wouldn't be sleeping on an uncomfortable couch. For a while, my mom and I slept in the living room, her on the couch and me on the air mattress. Up until 2 years ago, my mom reverted a room in our basement into a bedroom for me for Christmas so I can get some privacy. For myself, basically. My mom still sleeps in the living room on the couch, so she doesn't have any privacy, except for the back porch. So she pretty much just sits out there all day. It had to have been a year or 2 ago, in late summer, early fall, but she was sitting on the porch, as she usually does, and she looks out into the backyard and sees something standing in the alley, right behind our fence. It was pretty dark out, so she couldn't make out exactly what it looked like, but she said it had a human figure, was completely white and about the size of the poles we had in the yard. She told me that it hopped the fence no problem and started sprinting at her, like if it were running a marathon or something. It then got a couple feet away from the porch window, and then just disappeared. She said that she was so scared that she was completely frozen the entire time. She didn't move her body for a good 20 seconds because she was scared that if it saw her move, it was going to come back. She just kept moving her eyes to get them to adjust to the dark so she could see if there was anything still there outside. To come outside to the porch, you need to walk through the kitchen, and that's where I was. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she bursts through the door and runs to the sink to get a knife. So now I'm panicking because I thought there was a murderer outside or something, and then she tells me what happened. We both stayed there for a good hour just looking out the kitchen window to see if this thing was still there. I haven't talked to her about all that then since, until now, mostly because I just forgot. I just wanted to share and see what people thought. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not good at writing these stories, and so I've tried my best. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. Hello. I had an experience with one of these beings when I was around 8 years old, and it's really baffled me ever since. I'm glad others have seen them too, and look forward to reading other encounters. I was around 8 in the lounge at home. The lounge was at the end of a hallway, and at the other end of the hallway was a disabled bedroom shower for my dad. To the left and to the right was a door leading to the garage and garden. I can't remember what I was doing in the lounge at the time, but all of a sudden, I had a really powerful urge to look at the end of the hallway. We had recently bought a coat stand from a boot sale, and this was in the middle of the hallway now. As I stood there, I saw a human outline, but entirely filled with TV-like static. I remember little bits of yellow and blue in it, but it was mainly white, and it came out of the bedroom on the left and was in a running stance. But it was really weird because it was in slow motion, and it ran from the left to the back door on the right. As it ran, it grabbed the coat and pulled it down with it, and it fell to the floor. I was just standing there in shock and so scared. I ran to my sister and told her what had happened. When we went back to the hallway, the stand was still on the floor. That was the only time I saw it. I don't know why I saw it or why it pulled the stand down or what it was, but it was just so surreal. I don't know if this was a cryptid or if this is paranormal or what. I did have some other experiences in that house that were paranormal deemed, so maybe it was connected. About 12 to 15 years ago, I used to go hunting with my uncle and his friends in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan near Paulding. We had a large plot of private land deep in the woods. It took about 30 minutes to drive through winding trails off an old road to get there. My uncle kept a few trail cams around, some food plots to keep track of deer throughout the season. Every year, we would collect the SD cards from the cameras and sit around a laptop in the cabin to go through the photos. One year, we had a camera mounted about 20 feet up a tree. Viewed over a small hill, we planted a crop of alfalfa grass near the deer blind I used. Well, this one year, going through the photos and after a few normal pictures of birds and deer, we get to an extremely disturbing image. Something triggered the camera at about 3 in the morning, in the pitch black. All you can make out is some kind of face suspended maybe 3 feet from the air of the camera, so more like floating 20 feet in the air to be exact. It's hard to make it out in the fuzzy black and white deer cam quality of 2007, but you can make out a swirling blur of hair, eyes, and teeth. It's easy to assume an animal, except this is just a head. A floating, human-like head, wrapped in gnarled hair, eyes that were creepy black and red look from the camera flash, and a gaping mouth of sharp teeth. The hair actually reminded me of a Native American, very long, straight and dark, and just very messy and frizzy, like it would be if it had been rolling around in brush and dirt all day long. I've had the image burned into my mind ever since and have tried to get my uncle to dig it up among his pile of SD cards over the years. If I ever find it, I'll make sure to let you know. You have to understand that this was shown among a bunch of old outdoorsmen that know just about every species in those woods. And this image made them quit drinking and keep one eye open all weekend long. Let's just say I didn't stay in that deer stand close to dark anymore. What are your thoughts? For background, I was living in Boise, Idaho at the time, and this specific sighting was near Hillside Junior High, if you're familiar with the area. It was in autumn, about 9 or 10 I believe, after it had already gotten dark. I was having a sleepover with some friends and we decided we wanted some snacks, so 2 of us set out for the dollar store. To do this, we took quiet neighborhood streets that were mostly old people already in bed. As we passed a crossroad, we saw the creature. In my memory, it was sort of humanoid, but had long skinny arms and legs and a large head. It was at the end of the street, about 150 yards away, so I don't have the exact features. However, the most striking thing, that which allowed us to see it, was that it was very large. It crouched down in front of a house, but even then it was about as tall as their roof, so I'd say 13 to 15 feet. I wanted to investigate, but my friend, probably afraid of dying, really just wanted to get going to the store. Unfortunately, the store was closed when we got there, so we had to turn back, and when we passed that road again, whatever that thing was had gone, further convincing us that it was something anomalous. Has anyone else ever seen anything like this, or maybe knows of a creature in my area that fits the description? I'd really like to know more if I could. So, I have been kind of wanting to share my creepy encounters and experiences for a bit, but what my sister told me a few days ago made me want to share this possible skinwalker encounter. I'm Native American, and so is my father and siblings. My mother has very little, but there is some. We weren't involved with any tribes, but I do enjoy looking, reading, and trying to be active in the Native culture. There are also plenty of tribes in the state that I live in. A few weeks back, I was asking my father about the tribes around here, and asking if there was a possibility that skinwalkers could be up here. He kind of avoided the question, but did tell me that a tribe up north was notorious for murders, both by members and unexplained ones. I tried seeing if I could get any answers from him, but there was nothing else. Now, time for the actual encounter. Both my sister and I have experienced them the most, but my brother has also had some unexplained scratching and whispering at night. It was rare, but it did happen. The encounter started at the beginning of the summer in 2017. Now, me and my sister share a room. She's always been scared of the dark, so being the nice big brother that I am, I have shared a room with her. Anyway, it was around maybe 11 p.m. when me and my sister heard a weird sound. It sounded like a bird call, but definitely not normal. It sounded like somebody with strep throat trying to mimic a crow. Both me and my sister just looked up at our phones and gave each other a weird look. We live in an apartment complex that's located on the edge of a small town. The town itself is a druggie town, so for like the first hour, we thought it was just some druggie outside tripping out. But it lasted 3 hours, finally ending around 2 in the morning. My sister had fallen asleep and everything was quiet. But then I heard the big dogs down the road start barking like crazy. I thought it was just a weird timing thing, or maybe they saw an animal. But looking back, I think it might have been a skinwalker. A few weeks go by and the same sound starts again at around 10 p.m., or even 11, and would usually end around 1 or 2 in the morning. At first, me and my sister didn't really pay any attention to it, and eventually thought it was actually a weird bird. But one night I had slept over at my friend's house, which was a trailer on the edge of town, right near mine. Me and my friend were just about to fall asleep on the couches when I heard that same sound. I sat up and looked right at my friend. "You heard that, right?" I had asked her, thinking it was just imaginary. "Yeah, it sounded like a bird. Why?" She told me back, probably thinking I was crazy. "Oh, it's nothing. I just hear that a lot." I replied back if I told her she probably would have believed me, but I just tried to make it seem like it was nothing. The night the sound lasted until I fell asleep. Fast forward another week and we're hearing the same sounds at night. My sister now has started to get paranoid. I was too, but I just told her it was nothing. It was just some dumb bird. At this point in the summertime, I was listening to lots of skinwalker stories and started connecting their similarities to what was happening with me. One night, me and my sister were just chilling in our beds with our window open when the noises started up again. This time, they sounded more ragged and sickly. They stopped pretty quickly after they had started. Me and my sister just shrugged at each other and went back to our phones, when suddenly, right next to our window, we hear the most blood-curdling scream. It wasn't human. It sounded like a baby screaming, crossed with a dog yelping. With that sound ringing in our ears, me and my sister both jumped and she screamed, hiding under her covers. I honestly hid under my covers with my heart racing. We waited what seemed like hours until my sister whisper yelled at me, asking if it was safe. I had to put my big boy pants on and uncover to close the window. I did so rather quickly, but when I got to the window, nothing was there. My sister wanted to tell our parents, but I knew they'd never believe us. The next day, though, I had asked if they heard anything, which they said they hadn't. I brought this stuff up to my 3 friends one night while having a sleepover. At first, most of them took it as a joke, but then I explained how I felt that I was being followed and having a sense of dread 24/7. They then seemed to believe me, and I told them that I thought it followed me to their houses. And what freaked us all out that night was my friend's dog started barking and growling like crazy. Afterwards, one of my friends had remarked, "Why did we become friends with a native?" It made us laugh and calmed the atmosphere the rest of the night. Back home, my sister had told me that the noises stopped while I was gone, which pretty much had confirmed me that it was indeed following me. Constantly now, I was feeling dread and couldn't sleep at night. That scream ringing in my ears and the sound outside, increasing by each night, sounding more and more sickly. Like I said, this had been lasting all summer, so eventually we just got used to it. Sometimes it sounded like there was more than one, but as long as it didn't get close, we didn't care. At my friend's house, it was still the same, paranoid of seeing it. Even walking my dogs at night freaked me out because their gaze would fixate on something in the tree line, just out of my sight. They wouldn't bark or anything, just stare, and then start sprinting towards home. I'd follow, of course, gripping the leash so they wouldn't get away. It really freaked me out. One night, I caught a glimpse of it through the curtain crack. The noise had gotten closer. Me and my sister were prepared to hear another of those terrible screams, but no. I looked out the window as the wind blew in, and I saw what I believe was the Skinwalker. It looked so sickly and thin, its eyes sunken in, and its face looked like it was scowling. I just stared at it until the curtain moved back, and then it was gone. The dread had filled me even more. After that, we heard less and less. Toward the end of the summer, we had heard it again, and I decided to record the sound. It sounds weirder on the recording, but it's there. I wish there was a way to show it on here, but everything had died down until recently. I still have that constant feeling of dread, and I've become more paranoid, but I know what I've been experiencing is real. Last month, me and my siblings and Dad saw a white deer. I know that means good luck, but just the other day, after my dad picked me up from work, he told me that on the way, he had seen a white wolf sitting on the road, just watching the cars. I don't know if this is significant, but it's something to note. Also, my sister has been experiencing things while in her room. Just last week, she came running out of the room saying she heard scratching at the window. It's all just super freaky and weird. I'm already kind of a paranoid guy, but this is all too weird to just be coincidences. About 7 years ago, in Sierra Vista, a little city in Arizona, about 15 minutes from the Mexican border, misfortune had hit hard, and I had been homeless for around 6 months at that point. So, the usual schedule for me was to be awake until sunrise. The nights were cold, and staying moving kept me warm. And the first rays of sunlight were so warm that I was finally able to sleep. I would only sleep for a little bit, though, before I was back up and hitting a local charity for lunch. Catnap through dinner, wake back up as the sun goes down, and wander through the desert to stay warm until sunrise. I'll run you through my schedule so that you know this thing happened during my normal operating hours while I was fully awake. It's not possible that it was a dream, and not likely to be my imagination. So I had two routes. During the day, I would be in town, so I would be unarmed, but I had a straight-edged sword back in my burrow that I had brought when I had a job in a car and a house. During the night, I wandered the desert and would often be exploring far enough out that I could no longer even see the lights in town. So, I would wear my sword sheathed on my back, a just-in-case measure, and I'd really only ever used it to carve up yucca stalks for the roof of my burrow. Okay, setup complete. Here's what I saw. I'm walking along, following the edge of a small wash, twirling a stick I found. I'd walked for about an hour to get there, so I was probably a good 5 or so miles from any human on the planet. I hear a thump-thump from up ahead, but there's some scruffy bushes ahead, so I can't really see anything. Not wanting to sneak up on something dangerous, like a mother bear or something, I take my stick and smack the nearest tree a couple times. The thumping stops, and about 30 feet ahead of me, I see a head poke up from behind a bush. A head I've seen before. Kinda. It had big eyes and tufty bits on it and was basically set up like any other primate face, but it also looked almost reptilian. So what I did any normal person would do, and grabbed my sword handle and yanked it. Well, it doesn't really work like that. I yanked it forward and accidentally broke the strap that kept the sheath on my back. So here I am, brandishing a sheathed sword at a lizard monkey, 5 miles from nowhere, and this thing stands up to a full height of 4 feet, and Hussein bolts itself away from me with this bizarre ostrich person gait that was more awkward to watch than it was scary. I went back to my burrow. Salvation Army had fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and corn the next day. I was 7 or 8 years old and visiting my paternal grandparents with the rest of my family. They lived deep in the woods, and I always hated it there. It felt like something was always watching, and was always eerily quiet, like not even crickets chirping. My little brother and I shared a bed in one room on the ground floor. My brother would sleep at one end, his head against the window wall, and I would be on the other, facing the window. On this particular morning, I woke up first. The sun was brilliant, making the room gold through the curtains. And there, a silhouette against the window, was the deer with the biggest rack of antlers I had ever seen. It was right there, like almost pressed up against the window in profile. I stared in awe, and then that is when it changed. In one smooth movement, it reared up its hind legs, and it was no longer a deer, but a man. There were only 2 men in the area, my grandfather and my dad, and it was clearly neither of them. My grandfather was very built for his age, and my dad had a gut. This silhouette was clearly younger, muscular, but not the like a brick way my grandfather was. It exuded strength and scared the hell out of me. It stared to the side for a moment, and then strode off with purpose. I don't know what I saw. I want to believe it was just the groggy mind of a half-awake child, but I remember the fear slicing into me. I remember the feeling of something being out there, waiting, watching. I saw a humanoid, something in the woods outside my childhood home. This was in rural northern Wisconsin, and at the time I was 14. Up until that day, I had zero fear of the woods. In fact, I spent most of my time out there exploring, and I feared nothing. My parents had a fairly lousy marriage and fought a lot. I felt more at home outside than in the house. On hot nights, I'd take a sleeping bag and sleep on the roof of an old shack on our property. I saw bears. I saw wolves. They were always more afraid of me than me them. I don't believe in ghosts, Bigfoot, demons, or even God. I only got lost out there once when dark fell sooner than had expected. I stayed calm, found the northern star, and knew that I continued south, I'd eventually come across the old railroad tracks near my house. Even the thought of spending the night out there didn't even bother me. The thought of my mom's rage when I didn't come home did. So it was summer. I had just turned 14. My mom had left my father. My father worked all the time. Sister was living on her own. Yeah. Once school was out, it was me and my cat, and this was before the internet or even smartphones. We lived on a dead-end dirt road, and around noon, I took my usual stroll down the long driveway to check the mail. My cat followed me everywhere, and I actually kind of relied on him to give me a heads up if there was a bear or something else close by. A bit of movement behind me as I stood at the mailbox made me aware that there was something across the road in the trees, but there were pesky deer everywhere. I heard a loud crash, then, like something very loudly making its way through the brush. It's like every classic horror story. My brain had no capability for the thought of anything paranormal or spooky. I simply tucked the mail under my arm and headed into the woods to investigate. My cat, of course, followed close behind. I got about 10 yards in when I noticed what I hadn't noticed before. There was no noise. Nothing. It was a beautiful June day, and there wasn't a single bird singing, no insects, no leaves rustling. It was absolutely silent. At the same time I registered the silence, I got that eerie feeling that something was watching me. I stopped immediately and started scanning the woods for deer. Hunters will know what I'm talking about when I say you look for the shape of a deer instead of trying to pinpoint them by color. That's when I spotted it. 2 brown furry legs, the top of it concealed by tree branches. I went to sigh with relief when my cat hissed. I looked down and he was completely poofed out with his back arched, looking at the same thing that I was. I looked back up and the legs had moved. Not like a deer, like a human. Everything happened at once after that. I dropped the mail, picked up my cat by the scruff, and ran for it. Whatever was out there with me was running after me. I have never ran so fast in my life. I tore up the driveway, into the house, locked the door, and grabbed my phone. I called my next-door neighbor, who was the ex-chief of police, and he came over immediately with his pistol. He checked out the spot I was in, and, of course, found nothing. I was so hysterical, I was in tears. He stayed with me until I was able to reach my mom and have her come get me. Of course, they thought I was completely high, or even delusional. I know exactly what I saw and felt, though. It was broad daylight. I never felt safe in those woods again and stopped sleeping outside entirely. I should probably add that I thought I was looking at a deer's forelegs, but once it took a step, I realized that the legs were far too thick and human-like for that. And there were only 2 legs, not 4. Plus, I realized it was way too tall for a deer to be concealed by the tree branches. It all just happened within a matter of seconds. I was, and still am, calm, the rational middle child, and my parents trusted me. Hell, they let me sleep outside sometimes, and we all did to catch a meteor shower. I'd casually mention running into a wild animal, and my dad would just say, "You made a lot of noise? Good." I was quiet and sensible, and had never freaked out about anything before then. I had my neighbor's number for emergencies and had never called him prior to that. This is how shaken I was. I was embarrassed when he and my mom looked at me like a fool, and later when my dad also did not believe me. Not once did my instincts set me off in those woods until that very moment, when I absolutely beyond a doubt realized I was prey and ran for my life. Okay, so I used to live in Vancouver, Washington, on a cul-de-sac, Orchard Dell Court. It was a T-shaped cul-de-sac with another road going off the side of the T. So I was heading to school at about 8 in the morning. I only had to walk about a block from my house to where the cul-de-sac meets the main road, St. James Road. This was your typical everyday route that I took. However, that morning was different. When I got close to St. James, I looked up from me feet, and across the road was what I can only describe as a creature. It was made up entirely of black spheres. In the shape of a man, it definitely had 2 legs, 2 arms, and a torso, and a head. But again, all made up of black spheres about a foot wide, a little bigger than a basketball. All the spheres had a texture to them I have never seen before. That is creepy enough, but it was dancing around a pole that was across the street. The thing is, and that's really hard to convey, is that this thing projected nothing but pure malevolence, and I felt that this thing was bad. I mean, like really, really bad. I would not say it was evil, it just was bad. It's like the difference between saying a man can be evil, but a man can also be good. This thing could not have possibly of being good being there the way it was. It was bad through and through. Anyway, when I looked at it, it stopped dancing, looked at me, and just popped out of existence. It did not fade. It did not make a sound. It was just there one moment, and the next moment, it was gone. I was very freaked out, but it's not like I was hurt or felt bad. I was just scared. Anyway, I went to school like normal, and I was a little shaken up. Well, that night, there were some kids racing cars drunk, and there were 3, 4, maybe 5 people killed. The driver and all the passengers all died instantly. When I went out with my father to the corner where it happened, and I was shocked because it was the exact same intersection where I saw the thing from the previous morning. I cannot help but think I saw something strange that morning, something I was not supposed to see. Whatever the creature was bad news. Maybe, just maybe, it had something to do with the death of those students. We'll never know. I was hiking up the Cascades in Oregon. I was in a more remote area of the range. On the 6th or 7th day of the trail, the hair on my back of my neck started to stand up. I just chalked it up to being a mountain lion in the area. But the weird thing was the uneasy feeling had never left. That night is when I heard the howling. It wasn't wolves or bears or any other animal I had ever heard before. The closest thing I could relate it to is the noises apes and monkeys make. This persisted for the next few nights. Eventually, things started rummaging through my campsite. Naturally, of course, I assumed it was a bear or even raccoons. But then on the 11th day, I woke up and my food bag was removed from the tree. Something had cut the line through. All of my food was gone. I decided to keep pushing. I had 4 days left till the end of the trail. I'm familiar with what I can and can't eat in the area, and I could always fish for food. The same nightly activities occurred on and off, and the 13th night, something came and started throwing rocks right at my tent. For some reason, I lost it. I screamed into the darkness for whatever it was to leave me alone, hoping it was just some person messing with me, and maybe they'd scream out, "Sorry, mate," or something. Instead, it grew quiet for the first time in nights. Nothing could be heard. Then a scream, louder and more vicious than any other night, cut through. Then nothing. Complete and utter silence again. Despite it being quiet, I was not able to sleep that night. So, I waited. The next day I continued on my hike, dead tired, just wanting to get out. The hair on the back of my neck still standing, the forest still quiet. I felt like I was being hunted. Towards the end of the day, I had sat down to rest before pushing a few more miles when I saw it. Something tall and large, bigger than any man or animal I had seen, sliding through the forest, not making any noise. I yelled at it, and it turned to look at me. I never got a good look at it through the trees and the brush, and it was dark, but I knew that whatever it was causing this. I threw a rock at it and then pulled my knife out. This thing just kept staring at me. I don't know what kicked in, but I no longer felt scared, and I was angry, and I ran at this thing. It ran for me, and I chased it into the woods. It had long strides and easily outpaced me, but I continued the chase. After several minutes, I gave up and collapsed in exhaustion. I rested for a bit before backtracking my way back to my backpack and resting area. I was tired and made camp there. Another night of silence when I woke up the next day and had about 10 miles till I was out. Exhausted, hungry, mentally drained, I finally made my way out. As I got closer and closer to the end of the trail, the typical forest noises returned. Birds, bugs, mice running through the undergrowth. All of these noises slowly returned. I no longer had this feeling of unease. I got to trail's end, sat in my car, and cried. To this day I still pass it off as someone just messing with me. But the way that thing moved in the forest, I just don't know. I told a park ranger about it, and he jokingly said they have a bunch of Bigfoot sightings in the area, but most likely it was a local messing with me, or of course, writing it off as my own imagination. I do a lot of long hikes, but that 15 days was by far the worst. This happened back in 1997 in the springtime. I was in college at the time, driving around somewhere in town later at night. I guess probably the scariest part of the whole story is the fact that I was in town when I saw this animal. Something I suspected you would only see if you were out far, deep into the wilderness, but I guess that's not the case. The road I was on was fairly busy during the day, but did have sections of road where there were no houses or even commercial zoning around, which was a part of the road I was on at the time of this encounter. I was driving back alone in my '93 Honda Accord when I came to an area of road where I saw this large black animal walking alongside the road. My first thought was that somebody had maybe lost a horse or something because this animal was just so large, but as my headlights illuminated more and I got closer, I could clearly see this was not a horse at all. It was not a cow, and it did not have the distinctive shape that a bear does. It was much more lanky and defined, if that makes any sense. It was very dog-like, and it never once turned its head to look over at me. It was walking alongside of the road, heading the direction, and I was never paid attention to. It's like I didn't exist to this thing. As I saw it and thought to myself, what the hell is that? I slowed way down to try to get a better look at it, but as I got closer, that's when I noticed what looked like scabs and mange all over its body with large missing patches of fur. That's when I noticed its head and face just a little bit more, and I chalked it up to being a really deformed coyote, except I'm pretty sure coyotes don't get anywhere near that size. This thing was a massive, massive animal. The best way I can describe it to you from what I saw was a really big, mangy, coyote-looking dog. It didn't quite look like a coyote, but it didn't quite look like a regular dog. I've never seen anything like it. It looked like it had patches of fur missing and scabs all over its skin. Its skin was really dark and had way too many teeth for its mouth. They looked like Swiss Army knives. They were so incredibly sharp. Even I was able to notice how defined and sharp they were from as far away as I was. This animal had to have been close to the size of a horse, just in sheer size alone. I honestly, like I said, thought it was a deformed bear or a dog, It looked so bizarre, I couldn't quite make out exactly what it was, other than it having very distinctive canine features that personally stood out. I didn't get a good look at the eyes as I was driving, and I only had a few seconds to really take in everything that I saw. The snout though, the snout definitely stood out to me, along with the ears and the teeth of course. It did scare me, but I was more intrigued than anything else really. I tried to do a little digging and to see if I can find anything on it, but everything I looked up just pointed to a mangy coyote, or even the chupacabra that looks kind of similar to what I saw, but not near the size that I did. I've only told a few people about what I saw, and surprisingly, they don't believe me. Especially when I tell them the size. Gosh, it was so huge, and I think that's what startled me the most. I decided to keep researching, and that brought me to the topic of Dogman. This happened to me on the East Coast, and I've only researched just a little bit on the topic. But all that nonsense seems to point to the Midwest. I don't know if I believe something like that, considering even Bigfoot to me is laughable at best, but I still can't explain what I saw. Maybe it was just a really big deformed manged bear, and my imagination is turning it into something that it isn't. I've ran it through my head so many times, and I just can't think of a single animal that even looks remotely like that in the Pennsylvania area. I live a little ways out of town, actually in a really small little single-wide trailer. I don't have a whole lot around me, and just a few neighbors scattered throughout. The neighborhood I live on is definitely spread out, so to speak. I have a small yard in front of my house with a big maple tree that hangs over my front yard, as well as the driveway. The small road that connects to the front of my house is a pretty untraversed road for the most part. Not a whole lot of traffic day or night. Beyond that is a large open field. I would say probably a few acres worth of just undeveloped land that's sat there for quite a while. Beyond that is just wilderness and more undeveloped land. As of lately, I've been having some really terrifying experiences where I live. The first time I experienced this was just a few months ago when, out of my window, I see this tall, upright figure running towards my house. Terrified, I locked and closed my windows, made sure my doors were locked, and called the police. Then, to my horror, as I'm on the phone with the operator, the door handle starts to jiggle violently. I remain as calm as I can, thinking someone's trying to break in. Police arrive within 5 minutes, and of course they can't find a trace of anything. Although I wasn't quite sure how to explain to them that I saw this tall, upright figure with pointed ears. Anyway, fast forward a couple days, and I see this figure wandering around my house again. Terrified, instead of calling the police, I hunker down in my bedroom, hoping they would just go away. This, what I thought at the time was a person, begins jiggling my door handle harder and harder again, trying to get into the house, banging on the door and banging on the side of the house. This person paced all around for hours and hours, and for whatever reason, I'm not sure why I didn't feel like calling the police this time was necessary, but that probably was my biggest mistake. A few days go by and nothing happens. In fact, I think a whole few weeks went by without anything happening. And then again, I see this figure come up from the field again, and I get a much better look at it, since there's a street light not too far down the road that illuminates most of the road at nighttime. And what I saw horrifies me. This black shape, I guess I would call it, shaped like a person, looks like a person, but is much taller, and I could tell had a dog-like head and pointed ears. The only thing I could make sense out of it was maybe I was looking at a werewolf or something. I don't know. I didn't hear any sounds or see any sights, but I definitely saw the outline of this thing once again run towards my house. Without wasting a second, I called the police department and had them send another officer over to investigate the situation. Of course, they only got there in about 5 to 10 minutes, and this thing disappeared. At this point, I began getting threats saying that I was making false claims, and so I was told that if I called about this issue again, detained and charged with a crime. At this point, I kinda knew the police weren't going to do anything, So I continued to wait and wait until this thing came again so I can get a better look at it. I don't really own any guns or any other heavy amounts of firepower, but I do have a baseball bat and some bear spray, so I should be ready in case this thing does break in. I really have no idea what I'm going up against, but I will admit I am scared shitless, especially knowing the police are virtually powerless to me in this situation to help. I've also inquired other neighbors about seeing a similar thing, but no one has really mentioned anything like I'm describing. I try to watch the field at night or in the dusk time because that's when it seems to become most active, but again, I don't see anything usually. It only happens late at night, around midnight, until something happens. I don't always see it, but the few times I have, I just happened to catch it as it was running towards my house. I don't know if this is a literal werewolf, or if this is just a person in a costume, or what's going on. It hasn't happened for a few weeks, but like I said, it's been happening on and off for the past few months. It's always the same pattern. This thing will come up to my house, rattle the door handle heavily, bang on the door, bang on the house, pace around the house for a while, and then vanish like nothing ever happened. I'm currently 29, and this happened to me back when I was an early teenager. I lived alone with my father in a more secluded area that had a lot of woods and forests behind us. Because we kind of lived in a smaller house, we were on the outskirts of town, and a wood stove was our primary source of heating. I spent a lot of my falls and winters splitting wood outside in a clearing in the back side of our property. There was this really old, cool stump that I always used to split my wood on. My father would go and fell a bunch of old dead trees and cut them up for me. Then it was my job to split all the rounds and then stack them. I did this for many, many years, but this isn't what my story is about. I'd just like to start off with my story that I do believe in the paranormal and things that can't be explained, and to this day, I'm not quite sure what was watching me. The first time I remember seeing it was when I was splitting wood, and I got that feeling I was being watched. Checking my surroundings, I quickly noticed that peering out of the woods about 100 or so feet away was this large wolf-like creature that would just watch me. I'm not sure if it was curious or planning anything malicious, but it just kind of sat there, still as a statue, and watched me as I split rounds and rounds of wood. I would keep periodically checking to see if it had moved closer to me or had disappeared, and it would just stay in that one spot for hours. This thing never moved a muscle. I'm not quite sure if it knew that I could see it, because even though it was hidden behind trees, it was visible enough to me that I could make out it was a rather large wolf-like animal. It scared me at first, but after this kept occurring and this thing was just watching me, I realized it probably wasn't going to do anything since it had not yet. Sometimes I wonder if it would have came closer had I not had a big splitting maul, but I'm not too sure. The other odd thing is that as this went on over the years, it always appeared in the same spot and stayed as still as possible for hours on end. I would be lying if I said there weren't days where my dad made me go out there and split wood that I was not incredibly nervous. I wasn't quite sure that this thing was standing on two legs or what, because all I would see is this massive body and this huge wolf head watching me from afar. It looked fairly shaggy and maybe more coyote looking, and the fur color on the face from what I remember. I really don't know why this creature would be in the area other than we had a really high deer population at the time. I'm no expert and I don't know what those things eat, but I would like to think I do assume that it did eat the deer, if that makes any sense, since it probably was a predator. For the longest time, I had convinced myself that this was just waiting for the right moment to attack me, but in all those years of waiting and splitting wood, it never did. I never did tell my father about what I saw because he is such a hard-ass, a no-nonsense type of individual. I knew he would have just blown me off as being crazy or trying to get out of work and being lazy. I do wonder though from time to time if he ever experienced the same experience I did if he was ever out there felling trees or even cutting up old dead ones. I probably should have asked him before he passed away. All of this mainly occurred in the fall and winter, just about every single year from the time I started splitting the wood. I want to say about 12 years old. This lasted up until I was 16 when we moved houses, and I no longer lived there. It also makes me wonder why I never really saw this thing in the spring and summertime, but I don't recall ever really going out and looking for this thing either way. It just kind of showed up whenever it did and watched me for however long it wanted to watch me for. I know one thing was definitely for certain. Out of all the times that I knew this thing was around me, watching me, there was never a moment that I felt like I could have comfortably let my guard down in fear of this thing waiting for the moment to strike. Maybe, just maybe, it never quite found the right moment. Back in 2004, I worked in a very small hospital in a very tiny town. This hospital was pretty limited in its services, and even the ER was fairly tiny. Usually, if there was anything serious that we couldn't provide patients, which looking back was quite a number of things, it wasn't uncommon for patients to be life-flighted to other hospitals. Because we were such a small hospital and so short-staffed, our security staff that I was a part of was also pretty small too. It was just me and this one other guy named Earl, who I always remember was this older, funny fella. He was my superior on the job and showed me the ropes when I first got hired. There wasn't really a whole lot to learn, fortunately enough. This hospital is just a few blocks outside of a neighborhood with a lot of undeveloped land all around, and a decent-sized parking lot. We didn't see tremendous amounts of foot traffic, but we did get people coming in and out often enough. I luckily never had to kick anyone out or had to deal with any unruly individuals in my time, but I did have some unexplained encounters with an animal that I know nothing about. My first day working nights, Earl told me that sometimes people would see this really large black dog walking around the parking lot, pacing. It would terrify staff, patients, and other people who were coming and going. I thought he was just messing with me for the longest time until about 2 weeks into the job, I saw it for myself. I was outside having a cigarette, and it was probably about 2 in the morning, when I looked over to my left and saw this large animal walking around the eastern part of the parking lot. I thought to myself, what the fuck? I had never seen a dog so large before. Upon realizing it was the same animal that Earl had talked about seeing, I radioed him and asked him what the protocol was for that. He told me nothing, that animal control and police had already been called multiple times and there was nothing they could do. I'm not quite sure how that's the case, but that's just what I was told, so I wasn't going to argue with my superior. Anyway, since I couldn't really dispute it, I just had to do my best to ignore it and go back inside. The weirdest thing is that this animal was never seen during the day. I only ever heard about it from the night staff, and me seeing it several times out in the parking lot. People would often come in and ask about why there was such a huge loose dog in the parking lot. And there would also be times that staff would come inside and be white as a ghost, saying that this thing charged at them. Suffice to say that it sounds like people just kind of learned to live with it around here and to ignore it. It didn't come out every single night either. There would be periods of days, if not weeks, that nobody would see it, and then just like that it would reappear again, the same as it disappearing. Sometimes it would only be walking around for maybe an hour if not less, while other times it seemed to pace around all night long, and you could see it go in and out of the cameras. But always it would be gone by sunrise. There is one other particular night that really stands out. A man had run into the ER in a panic, telling us that this large dog attacked his car and he fled into the nearest building, which was of course us. He described it the same way everyone else describes the same animal that we all see. So of course, being the only one on shift at that night, I had to go investigate. His vehicle was out on the far side of the parking lot, Near the entrance, and besides a few scratch marks and a couple of dents, I didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. Whatever attacked his car, though, didn't stop after he fled, apparently. As creepy as it was, it just weirded me out and made me not want to be outside the rest of my job. I'm not saying this is a hellhound, and I'm not saying this is a ghost. I'm not saying this is even an alien. But what I can say is this is definitely some unknown animal, and I'm not quite sure what to make of the whole thing. I just try and follow Earl's best advice I can to this day. If you see it, just leave it be. I had an encounter with a real-life werewolf just a few weeks back. I'm terrible at taking down my stuff for the wintertime, and so I had left my pool up and a bunch of other junk in my backyard that I've been really needing to take down now for quite a while. Just a few weeks back, I finally decided that I'd go out there and stick it in my shop. I go out there with a flashlight since it gets dark out early, and I start to undo my pool. Real quick though, before I tell you what happens next. My backyard is huge. It's basically just an open field that spans across the land and goes off into state game land. At this time of year, a lot of it is covered in dead leaves that have fallen from the nearby trees. Getting up in the morning and looking out makes for an absolutely beautiful scenery. There's a lot of open area around with big locust trees scattered throughout and various other trees. We get a lot of deer wandering around this area too. Mostly does, but I have seen the occasional buck wander through here over the years. Most of the time though, they're just little 2-pointers and not quite ready. So I'm out there taking the legs off my big Intex pool, and I start to hear the crunching of leaves just about 30 feet away from me. I shone my flashlight over where I heard the crunch, and I almost pooped in my pants where I stood. It was like the Hulk from the comics, but wearing a werewolf costume. This thing was massive, glowing amber eyes, huge teeth, a massive Conan the Barbarian chest with muscles rippling underneath its fur. I could only bear to look at it for a few seconds before I turned around and sprinted into my house. I locked every door and turned off the lights. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I had no idea what the hell I just saw. My uncle has had encounters with Bigfoots years back, and maybe I can get him to send you the story so I know that creatures beyond our understanding exist. I never heard any sounds or anything weird after that sighting. I continued to leave all the lights off and everything locked for hours afterwards. The next morning, I sure as hell took advantage of the daylight, made sure there was nothing around where I was, and I got that pool taken down and put into my shop ASAP. I couldn't find any tracks or potential traces of anything there the night before. What I saw scared me pantsless. I feel like since time has gone on, I've been able to make sense of it all a little bit better than I did before. I didn't sleep well for the first couple of nights, just trying to convince myself it was real. I wasn't sure who I can tell, but I knew I had to talk to somebody about what I'd seen. I called my uncle to talk to him about it, and he believes me, since I know he shared with me his Bigfoot encounters. In fact, he knows more about this stuff than I, and told me this animal was probably in the area because of all the food and deer that's around. I also forgot to mention a little bit beyond my backyard drops down quite a ways to a mini canyon with a creek running through it. So I guess my area happens to be the perfect hunting ground. You got coverage, food and water, and no one to really bother you. I just hope it doesn't show its face again. I saw a bizarre-looking creature on my way home from a long business trip in the fall of 2013. I remembered the details pretty vividly, and I feel partially traumatized by the whole event. I was driving southbound on the 103 that leads down from Michigan into Indiana. Right near the border is a small river that runs perpendicular to the road called Pigeon River. It's not a big river by any means, but it is right near the border. It was pretty late at night at the time. I want to say around midnight, maybe just a little later. I didn't really see any other traffic on the road at the time of the incident. And yes, I pulled up to the bridge and I see this massive dogman stop halfway out onto the road. I only say dogman because that's the only way I know how to describe what I saw. It was really hairy and shaggy and stood probably about 8 feet tall. It was huge. It looked like a man and a dog mixed together. Its head was reminiscent of a German shepherd and had yellow glowing eyes and long claws on its hands. I saw it take one step into the road, turned and faced my car directly. I remember distinctly my jaw dropping in shock at the sight of what I was looking at. The look on this thing's face was like a deer in the headlights. It must have been surprised that I saw it because within half a second it disappeared quickly into the woods behind it, retreating back into the coverage. It all happened so fast it took me a long time to fully process what had happened. I think I was in such shock when I saw it that I don't even remember slowing down. It just looked over at me and then disappeared. I'd even told myself I just hallucinated the whole thing, trying to convince myself what I saw wasn't real. But it was. It was quite unnerving to say the least, and made me extremely uncomfortable the rest of the drive home. I had the shakes really bad afterwards, and couldn't really get good sleep the night after, even getting home just a few hours later. I guess what I saw was a monster, and now I know that they really do exist. I couldn't imagine being the poor soul whose car broke down right there by that bridge where I saw it. I felt like this thing was going to follow me home and get me. I shared my experience with a few close friends of mine who are into weird stuff like paranormal and things like that. And my one friend tells me that there's a lot of weirder similar sightings around that same area, in the whole Michigan Greater Peninsula area, I guess. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I saw because I'm sure some would consider it a werewolf, but I don't think that's what it was. I'm not really sure why it saw my car and then stepped back into the woods. I don't know if maybe it was trying to get somewhere and I startled it. It's almost as if it didn't want to be seen and was trying to really quickly conceal itself. It all just makes sense about the whole experience, I guess, if you think about it, but I'm still uneasy, to say the least. Anyway, this was my experience that I'm running into you, and I want you to know it really happened for me. And it's also been hard for me too, because people are so quick to write you off as crazy. I generally don't like to share my experiences, especially this one, but I feel like it'll be worth it, and hopefully, just hopefully, your listeners will be receptive. Thank you for your time. I didn't see anything, but I wanted to share this with you because it happened with me and my cousin. Okay, so a little pre-information about me. I'm pretty close with my cousin who moved to Idaho and has several hundred acres. Eastern Idaho to be exact. My cousin is an outdoor fiend and uses all the land he has to hunt on, as much as he can. He's pretty lucky too because he gets a lot of deer, elk, and other good game all over his land. Plus, there's tons of access to old logging roads and huge clearings where they came in and cut down a bunch of trees. It's pretty fantastic to say the least. He's gone through with me and we've set up so many tree stands in that whole area and scouted and have hiked and have had just great times together. Now, usually when I go and visit him, I'll stay for a couple of weeks at a time. I haven't gone and stayed with him in a few years, and so this happened just a few years ago during the fall when I went and visited him. He wanted to take me out one morning to go scout out some good places to put up a couple tree stands and just do some good old-fashioned exploring in the woods. We hopped in a small pickup truck and we drove around the backwoods areas to see if we couldn't find any good areas to dig around in. We came across a rather large clearing that had been cleared out by loggers years and years ago. My cousin always brings binoculars with him, because sometimes you could see if there's game in the area or nearby. Before setting up tree stands, he likes to see if there's been any recent signs or activity of potential deer and elk in the area. We get to this clearing and he pulls out his binoculars and scouts around the area to see if we can spot anything. We had already been thinking about putting up a stand in a couple of trees near us, so it was a good day already. Lots of wind coming our direction, so we didn't have to worry about anything picking up our scent. My cousin got up in the bed of his truck and began looking around. He started getting excited when he spotted some does and a big buck scouting out the area a little more. He froze and his entire demeanor changed from excitement to panic. I'm standing there looking right at his face and his expression was just wrong. I immediately panicked and thought bear with a cub is nearby. He interrupted that thought with the, "What in the hell am I looking at?" followed by a, "Whoa," just a few short seconds later. He pulls the binoculars down quickly and squints his eyes in the direction he was just looking. He then throws the binoculars back up and his jaw is agape, looking at whatever he's looking at. At this point, I'm kind of freaking out and wanting to know what the hell's going on. He doesn't say anything and continues to just watch, and then quickly jumps out of the bed of his truck and tells me we need to leave right now. Still thinking it was a mama bear and her cub, I didn't even question it, and we left. We hauled ass back out to his place. He doesn't speak a word the entire time, and he really seemed bothered. This wasn't him. He had been in dangerous situations, but never acted like this. He even told me a time he stumbled out into the darkness and was only 20 feet away from a mountain lion. That is so close to death, and even then he wasn't afraid. Anyway, we get back to his house and I finally get him to tell me what happened back there, and I wanted to know if it was a bear like I thought it was. He simply explained it to me that he saw something he's never seen before. A freaky looking timber wolf the size of a moose shot out of the woods onto the buck and tore this animal into pieces. I was confused and shocked, but what he told me had to have been the truth. The look on his face told me he was terrified. He was trembling the entire time. He said this wolf tore that buck to pieces in just seconds, and he knew that wolves did not get that big. I believe him, and whatever he saw really bothered him, like I said. The rest of the trip, we never went back out exploring, and I'm not sure if he's ever ventured out to that clearing again, but it really got to him. Anyway, I thought this would be a great thing to share to you. I'll start off by saying no. This isn't my story, but it was such a crazy encounter that I have asked each of my friends through the years to recount the events for me. This happened around the year 2000. About a year after this took place, I started dating one of these friends, and that's when I first heard about this whole dog-wolf story. I have since asked each friend over the years and miles apart, and they all remember the same encounter. Before my ex was even my boyfriend, well, let's call him Jay. He and our other friends were about 18 years old at the time. At that age, I remember it being an adventure to find a place to go smoke. Hey, let's hike to so-and-so and puff. The good old days when we got away from parents and planned a whole day around smoking. It was Jay and his best friend B and their girlfriends S and M. The four of them decided to drive to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful wooded area outside of Eugene, Oregon. It's more of a hill, but it's nature in its prime for sure. I've been out there many times growing up, and I know exactly what trail they were on, the main one that connects the parking lot to the river. They had driven in B's little white sedan, parked in the parking lot, and then walked to the river. On the way to the river from the lot, there's a very small bridge that crosses a small creek. This will be relevant for later. The group spent the day out there swimming and puffing and puffing and swimming, just being typical Oregonian teens. I can imagine that hunger is what drove them to go home after a few hours, as the sun began to set. Either activity alone is bound to get someone hungry, let alone both. So, they walked along the well-worn main dirt path to the parking lot. This path has since been paved, according to Google Maps, of course. It doesn't take but 20 minutes or so for them to get back to the little footbridge by the parking lot that they had crossed when they hiked in. When they reached this small footbridge near the parking lot, B looked out into the vast field between them and the wooded mountain, and noticed a huge dog near the tree line, about 100 yards away actually. They all later described it as the biggest dog they had ever seen. The dog was just sitting there, not looking scary, just looking like a humongous friendly dog. It was starting to get dark, but from M&J's descriptions and the drawings she did for me later in 2005, it was very shaggy and very furry. I may even still have that notebook where she drew the dog thing. If I find it, I'll let you know. My friends continued to walk across this small wooden bridge, and one of the girls screamed. The big dog was now on its hind legs, standing much closer than when they had seen it just a couple of seconds earlier. It had traversed most of the large field in just seconds it took them to get across this 10-foot long bridge. Whatever this thing was, it was fast, quiet, and stealthy. My 4 friends ran to the car, and they had the classic cliche, "I can't get the key in," because B was fumbling madly for the keys. At this point, the dog was standing on its hind legs still at the very edge of the parking lot, looking at them. Still had the dog face, still had the dog body, standing up obviously. They never saw it walking on all 4, or just 2. It was like every time they looked up, it was just standing there, closer. As Jay had said, every time they looked up, he was closer but not moving. All of them recounted how surreal it was to see a dog standing on its hind legs. I don't know if it ran for a few ticks and then stood up again at intervals in the field, but that's the way they describe it. Many times I've asked them, "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" No, it definitely was a dog standing on its hind legs. A big dog that was stalking them. Also, this is in Lane County, Oregon, in the year 2000. There are few, if any, bears out there. It would be odd, but then again, I wasn't there. The kids got into the car and sped off, leaving the Pisgah dog to his own business. I've never had a reason to doubt any of their stories. In fact, S doesn't even like to talk about the incident at all because it's just too creepy for her to recall. The events I'm about to describe are very true, and I will take them to my grave. These events happened around 2013 or 2014 midsummer in a small town in rural New Hampshire. Both stories also happened with one of my friends being present, and he witnessed the same things I did. The first event took place on a warm summer night. My friend and I live in the same town and only live about 2 miles from each other. At the time, I had my license and he did not, so I would drive to his house to hang out and play video games, or I would pick him up and drive back to my place to hang out. Right down the hill from my place is this old textile mill that has been closed for a while now, and there have always been rumors going around about how people died working in the mill years ago. And sometimes at night, if you look in the window, you can see ghostly figures still dressed in the old-time clothing. Across the street from the mill is a dirt parking lot that telephone companies park their work trucks in and grab them in the morning. I had just picked up my friend and we were driving back to my house. As we're driving by the dirt parking lot, we noticed something. The telephone company trucks were big, and you could see underneath them on the other side of one of the trucks. I saw a pair of legs and feet, like someone was just standing there motionless. The legs were very pale and stood out in the darkness, and there were no shoes, just bare feet. In fact, it kind of looked like the legs of a child who happened to be young, maybe 8 years old. As we kept driving and passed the truck, the feet and the legs disappeared like they were never even there. We were going fast enough that there was no way if it was an actual person that they could have ran off before we passed. I asked my friend if he just saw that, thinking I was crazy. "You mean the white legs and feet?" he asked. To this day, I still hope it was our imagination playing tricks on us, but sometimes I wonder if a child may have died working in the mill many, many years ago, when child labor was actually legal. This last event happened to me and my same friend as the ghost legs. It was late at night, and I was driving him home after coming home from the movies. Let me remind you that I live in a rural, woodsy town. We were on this stretch of road close to his place with woods on either side, not driving very fast, and the speed limit for that road is around 20 miles an hour. Just remembering this next part as I write this chills me to the absolute bone. As we are driving along this thing, it flies over the road just above the tree line. It flew next to a streetlight, which lit this creature up pretty good. At first, I thought it was just some type of bird, but as more of it appeared by the light of the streetlight, I realized this thing was way too big to be a bird of any type. The thing we saw had the body roughly the shape and size of a large wolf, but with short hair. It had bat-like wings, big enough to support its weight and size. The creature had front and back legs, unlike a bird, and also had a tail. Luckily, I didn't see it long enough to get a good description of its head. And I'm glad I didn't, because I was already completely paralyzed with fear, as I was. Later on, my friend claimed it had red eyes. I did not see that. The whole time this was happening, my friend and I did not say a single word. The rest of the way to his house, we said nothing. When we finally pulled his driveway, and I shut off the car, we both started freaking out. I was hoping I was going crazy, and to this day I would like to think I was, but I somehow saw the exact creature he did. We went on inside and told his brother, and he thought we were both crazy. And after that long of a while, we told no one because, who would believe us anyway? To this day, I don't know what kind of creature we saw. I just don't. Just thinking about going in the woods in that town now scares me. If anyone has any idea what we might have seen or has had any strange creature stories around New England, I would love to hear them. This story takes place in the deserts of Arizona. Me and my dad are on a camping trip with the rest of our family. But thanks to the size of the family, we had to take 2 cars. 1 car for the boys, and 1 for the girls. I had 3 sisters, but I was the only boy. 3 hours later, and nightfall approaches, making it harder to drive with only 1 headlight working. So, my dad decides we should stop and camp there for the night. I said I was down as long as we sleep in the car, not really camping, but if you had to choose between a car seat and the ground, then we'll talk. Anyway, he agreed, so we drove off the road onto the sand with cactus as far as the eye can see. We both began our descent into slumber. Only I couldn't, as I was a bit of an insomniac, which I was fine with. It just meant I could look up at the night sky. But then I heard the blood-curdling screech of some kind of humanoid being howling at the vast emptiness of the desert. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but coyotes don't sound like that. Frozen solid, I look out the window to see a tall, lanky creature standing on all 4s of its extremely long, unnatural appendices. At first glance, I would have just blended in with the cacti in the surrounding area with its seemingly prickly skin, but I didn't just peek and look away. I was flat out staring at it until my eyes locked with its 2 small white dots. It was all I could see. I'm shitting bricks at this point, but bricks turn to boulders as it full out charges at the small car, which could easily be flipped with very little effort. I guess that all the commotion woke up my dad because, before I knew it, we're driving off the sand back onto the road, flooring it the whole way, only to get the back window smashed in with the creature slamming its 2-fingered hand in the glass screen, sending shards everywhere, even into its own hand. It did not follow us for much longer, as it had glass shrapnel in its hand and it started to slow down and limp away, leaving blood marks on the back door. We kept driving away without looking back, fearing to see it again. Eventually, we had to stop as we caught up with the rest of the family. We all shared the same expressions on our faces. The look of terror looked on. That day is one I will never forget. This happened in 2015, when my husband and I were together. We've since separated, and perhaps this story will help you understand why. He and I married that year, and he always was a little off, sometimes more off than on. He served in the military and was proud of his time served, and I was proud of him too. However, he had a tendency toward visual hallucinations. I'm not sure if it's the whole PTSD thing or his family history of mental illness, but he saw things. Usually it always happened while driving. Once he saw an 8-foot spider casing the side of a barn while we were riding along the road. He asked me if I saw it. He was panicking. I, of course, didn't see it. Here, let me paint a picture. My mom lives deep in the rural South. Further down her road are old houses that people still live in, and use outhouses to this day still. They collect rainwater to drink, etc. Before you get to my mother's road, there's a well-kept farmhouse, pretty close to the main highway as a matter of fact. A highway with its own haunted issues, ghost cars and such. I'm not kidding. My sister says she's seen a dozen men walking out in the fields behind that house, dressed immaculately in white suits. I promise everything I'm saying is true to the best of my knowledge. He and I pull onto the highway one night just after dusk and are gaining speed as we pass that house. He's driving and I'm in the passenger side, head back, eyes closed, and the farmhouse is on the right of the car. Suddenly, my husband swerves and screams. My eyes open. In a blur, I see a white human-shaped creature running at the car. Pale white, maybe gray skin, crazed, angry eyes. I don't recall that it was wearing clothing. I just remember the flash of white skin. And those eyes. Human eyes. Unmistakably human, with all the rage and wild contempt that only a human being could be capable of. It was running right for my door, but we passed it before it made it to the car. He screamed, asked if I had seen it. I don't know why. I can't tell you why, but I told him I hadn't. He described it to me, and I reiterated that I hadn't seen it. Later on, I confessed that I had seen it, so I'm not a complete liar, I hope. I can't let go of the feeling that it wanted to do harm to one of us. It seems I had locked eyes with it, but it was only a split second, so I wonder what my mind has filled in to make sense of the situation. Worse, much more strange things happened to my husband and me, but I can't talk about those things. I feel safe enough describing this, however. For some reason, he seemed like a beacon for the unusual and the unexplainable. He and I separated largely due to his decreasing mental health, so I'm not sure what he's been seeing these days. But I know we both saw something that night. I'm just not sure what it was. Before I begin, I'm a 16-year-old male. About 3 years ago, I was in Virginia visiting family over summertime. We were right outside the DC area and staying in a 2-story house near the freeway. On the other side of the freeway was a forest. So my mother, her boyfriend Eric, and I were all staying with Eric's parents. We had brought some night vision binoculars and decided that tonight was the perfect time to use them. So after dinner, we gear up and head out. We pass under the freeway and head into the woods. When we get about 5 minutes into the forest, we set down our bags and take out our binoculars. My mother looks around with them for a while, seeing a few squirrels here and there. She gets tired of them and passes them to me. I look around for a while, being careful not to look at the freeway for fear of being blinded. I spot something behind a tree about 50 feet to our left. I concentrate on it, trying to figure out what it is. It looks like a pale, bald, anorexic man looking straight at us from behind a tree. I get a bit uneasy, but I'm hesitant to believe it's really there. I ask Eric to take a look, just in case. To my despair, he sees it too. He describes it much the same way I did.
Now, Eric is a former amateur boxer, and I train MMA almost every day, but neither one of us wants to stick around with that thing. We start heading back to the house, crossing under the freeway. We take another look behind us as a car goes by. All three of us see glowing eyes lit up by the headlights on the other side of the freeway. We say screw it and head back to the house. When we get back, Eric's parents are asleep, and my mother and Eric go upstairs to the guest room. There's only one guest room, so I have the couch downstairs. I'm a little too excited after seeing the thing in the woods, so I end up staying up all night. Around 3 in the morning, I am watching television and start hearing footsteps above me. I immediately remember our earlier encounter and panic a little. I try to calm down and tell myself it's just one of the dogs or maybe somebody who couldn't sleep. I keep hearing the footsteps for a while, until I hear a doorknob jiggle. I find it weird that they're trying to open a locked door, but I try to ignore it. They stop, walk around for a few more minutes, and then it's quiet again. I stay up until the sun starts coming up, and then pass out. My mom wakes me up, and I remember the footsteps from the night before. I described what happened and asked if one of them got up at any time. She says no, and I think it must have been one of the dogs. That is, until she tells me the room above me is the office. No one was in the office, and the door stays locked at night. I remember our encounter the night before, and my heart sinks as I piece it all together. I don't know if it was that thing for sure, but I think it was. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to figure out what that thing was. I've found 2 creatures that seem to match it. I think it was either a Wendigo or the Dover demon. Whichever one it was, I'm just thankful that the door was locked. I know I wouldn't be able to fight that thing, no matter how tough I am. A year ago, I met a really interesting man who eventually became a good friend to me. I'll call him Chris, just to protect his identity. We both have military background, so naturally, we spoke about some of our exploits in those past lives. He had an unexpectedly haunting story to tell, and when I later got this channel up and running, I asked if I could share it with you, so here we go. This took place on an undisclosed military base located in the damp jungles of a remote island. Chris says he remembers the wilderness being unnervingly quiet for at least a week leading up to this incident. The personnel stationed there chalked the silence up to a change in seasons or something. There had been reports of bizarre sightings, fast-moving animals no one could explain. Anyone who mentioned them was typically shut down with ridicule from fellow soldiers. The sightings were notably inconsistent with one another. Some saw large eyes, while others saw small ones. Some heard a big thing trudging boisterously through the woods. Others heard the sounds of something small and light sneaking around in the brush. No one had seen anything worth defending an inevitable argument, let alone losing their reputation over. Chris heard every report due to the fact that he was the desk sergeant at the time. Anyone who saw or heard something off, which could potentially impact the security of the base, would typically come to him to have it notated in the log. He never took the more fantastical reports seriously enough to actually write them down, of course, unbeknownst to the concerned soldiers who came to him. Some of them came just to talk about what happened, off the record. Anyway, which would typically end up with them just trading ghost stories. On the night in question, Chris and his team were on the far side of the island, an area which was completely uninhabited, where no human presence could be found for hundreds of miles in every direction. For that reason, the military chose that location for storing their weapons and explosives. Chris and a partner, who I'll call Barry, were conducting the nightly checks on the magazine storage, areas which lay several miles deep into the uninhabited zone. The jungle was still weirdly quiet, but it was good for them. being that their mission was to detect foreign intelligence or operatives tampering with U.S. equipment, or the occasional refugee group that washing ashore. They were on a road that rested in the valley of two mountains, bordered by a gigantic hill, thick and rocky with tall grass. As they drove along slowly with their Humvee windows down, they heard a heavy thud coming from the woods. A totally unexpected, unnatural sound emanated clearly from the tangled growth. The first thud drew their attention, but was quickly followed by other noises. Barry shut off the headlights and shut off the engine so they could sneak up on whatever or whoever was out there. They knew anybody attempting to navigate the dense vegetation would have to do carefully, taking time to carefully avoid injury. But, surprisingly, they could hear fast-paced walking, rustling through the tall grass. After just a few moments, the sound began to move parallel to the road. They restarted the vehicle and started to pursue the noise. The walking continued for a while as they followed it with their only running lights on, before suddenly stopping. They at first thought they'd lost track of whatever it was, so they turned the headlights back on, assuming it was a deer or something, and continued a distance down the road. As Barry proceeded to turn the high beams on, both men noticed something in the distance. Approximately 30 yards ahead, a humanoid creature jumping into the road and then into the brush on the other side. It was gray, over 2 meters tall, with a small oval-like head. Its movements were too swift for its size. The best way he could describe its leaping motion was like that of an impossibly nimble frog. Seeing the creature instantly gave Chris the feeling of being punched in the stomach. His heart sank so rapidly, and my adrenaline kicked in so fast that he began to feel nauseous, on the verge of vomiting. He laments the fact that neither of them had the will to chase after the creature, but the feeling of being at such a disadvantage was absolutely petrifying. The idea that they were stalking it raised the question: were they hunted or being hunted themselves? Whatever it was, the monster definitely had the tactical advantages of position and mobility. Chris and Barry turned their truck around and sped off into the night. The woods remained silent for at least another week, returning to the normal droning sounds of the local wildlife soon after. I have been in a long-distance relationship with my girlfriend now for a couple of years, and every summer and winter break, I am able to travel to go see her. This encounter happened about 2 years ago at my girlfriend's house. I should mention that my girlfriend lives on the outskirts of her city in Mexico, where houses are surrounded by 200 to 300 yards apart and surrounded by dense woods. Usually, days and nights there go about peacefully, accompanied by the sound of woods and the occasional car passing by from others who live nearby. I had always considered her place to be the perfect time to spend outdoors, well, until this occasion. Honestly, I don't think I have ever been this scared in my life. This sighting will be carved in my mind forever. On a chilly night of December, I was at my girlfriend's house. I had planned to spend the night here with her since she would have been there by herself all that day. Her mom was out of town and she didn't want to stay by herself either. We were having dinner in the kitchen at around 8 p.m. We chatted about activities we could do tomorrow, tasks her mom asked her to do, how much we missed each other, among others. After about an hour of conversation and laughs, we decided to go into the living room and cuddle on the couch, watching TV. We both got up and put the dishes in the sink. She went into her bedroom, and I went outside to the bathroom. The house layout consisted of a long corridor that connected pretty much every room in the house, and a back door at the end of the corridor which led to the patio. The patio was open, full of trees, plants, and the only thing separating the patio from the woods was a fence made up of stones and barbed wire that stood at around 1 meter tall. Halfway down the patio, there was the bathroom, being lit by a single and weak light bulb. So if anybody wanted to go, they had to walk outside, even if it had to be in the middle of the night. I'm not coming here at night, I thought. I remember when I opened the back door and stepped into the patio. A cold breeze stroked my face and sent shivers across my back. So I hurried to go back as quickly as possible because, to be honest, I was a little spooked going outside in the darkness, knowing that the woods were pretty much a few steps away. I finished doing my business, washed my hands, and started walking back, being careful not to trip on something because the light bulb was almost non-existent. I was about halfway when I heard a noise to my left, like someone stepping on a branch and breaking it. I stopped and quickly turned, trying to see what made the noise, but I could only see a portion of the fence and nothing but darkness beyond that. However, I had this weird feeling that someone or something was watching me, something on the other side of the fence. I stood there in silence for around 30 seconds, listening to the surroundings, only to notice the crickets had stopped chirping entirely. I got a bit freaked out because I knew for sure they were chirping when I first came out. I was somewhat scared to move, but I did anyway, almost running to get inside as soon as possible. When I returned, I went to my girlfriend, who was already in the living room, laying down on the couch with a blanket on top. She noticed I was a bit agitated and asked me what was wrong. "Your patio is scary," I jokingly said, not wanting to tell her what I felt because she hates anything that has to do with horror or scary stuff. I decided just to brush it off, so I ran around the couch and sat at the other end of it, putting my girlfriend's legs on my lap, asking what she was watching on TV. I turned to my right and noticed there was a huge window on one side of the wall that gave me a perfect view of the patio. I didn't see it before because it was next to a cabinet, being covered on the way into the living room. Now that I knew about it, I kept turning to see outside, still thinking how scary it looked. As we're watching a boring documentary, I took off my girlfriend's socks and started rubbing her feet below the blanket. After all, it was a chilly night and her feet were cold. We didn't have conversation. I was getting sleepy, but after around 20 minutes, I began hearing noises outside. Noises that seemed to be coming from the patio. I grabbed the controller and muted the TV just to make sure I was hearing right. And I was. It sounded like tiny twigs breaking and grass being brushed. I quickly turned to my right to see outside the window, but I could only see the plants and part of the trunk from a big tree. The noise, although faint, stopped for a few seconds, resumed a few moments later, and stopped again. I stood frozen, watching outside the window, almost as if waiting for a thing to appear. "What's that noise?" I whispered to my girlfriend, but after I didn't get a reply, I turned around and stood up a little to see she had her eyes closed and had fallen asleep. Now I was a bit freaked out, but I chose to believe it as it was probably a coyote or some other animal that lurks around in the woods at night. I kept watching the TV muted, waiting for the noise to start again, but after a while I realized it had stopped. I turned around one more time to see outside the window, and I felt my heart sink into my stomach. The first thing I noticed when I looked outside that time was a faint image of a gray, pale, and tall humanoid figure peeking from the side of the big tree trunk, staring right back at me. I suddenly froze in fear, not wanting to even slightly move or breathe. I watched this thing as it watched me, even though I couldn't see its eyes because of the poor lighting conditions. But I knew it was watching me. I knew it was aware of me. I somehow felt it. The creature was, like I said, pale. In fact, it was really pale. I could see the contrast between its skin and the bark of the tree. The creature was very thin, had skinny shoulders and torso, as well as an elongated neck. It looked like it was around maybe 6 or 7 feet tall. Unfortunately, or should I say, fortunately, I could not distinguish in detail any facial features, just because of how dark it was, but I could perfectly picture in my head the shadowy areas around where eyes would be for a person, and another one where the mouth would be. It was sort of grinning. At this point, I was trembling just a little, and I wanted to let my girlfriend know what I was witnessing, but I didn't want to move a muscle or break eye contact with that thing. I felt like I needed to remain calm and still or play dead to lose its attention. But no, the creature kept staring, not moving an inch, like it was trying to do the same. Then, to turn things worse, the creature started to make echoey clicking sounds. Kinda like a frog, but slower. And I noticed it began to turn its head to the left side and turned back to look at me really fast. I don't know what to think anymore. All I wanted was my girlfriend to wake up and prove to me that this was real. I began whispering her name in between my teeth and mouth, not even wanting to move my jaw. But she wouldn't wake up, and the thing kept doing the same, turning its head to the left and back to me really fast. The creature crouched kind of like when a big predator cats are hunting and lay low, preparing to attack. "What the?" I whispered. I know, stupid. I didn't even think the fact that if I woke my girlfriend up, she would start moving, and that thing would notice both of us. But I was so scared that I kept trying. This went around for maybe less than 15 minutes before I realized I still had my girlfriend's foot in my hand below the blanket. So the thing would not be able to see me moving, of course. Only using my wrist, I slightly pulled her foot back and forth, whispering her name again and again, but no response. Then I stood in shock when I saw the creature stand up again and started walking backwards, still looking at me, and disappearing into the darkness of the patio, doing the clicking sounds again. I passed saliva and blinked a few times, realizing my eyes itched from staring at the creature the whole time. For some reason, I couldn't turn my head around. I kept looking in the direction where the creature disappeared, listening for sounds and waiting for it to appear once again. A few minutes passed and I took the chance to turn around. Slowly, as if in slow motion, I turned my head to my girlfriend and started calling her name louder, while pushing her leg in quickly, scribbling my fingers on the sole of her foot to wake her up fast. Her foot jerked, and she started turning. I stood up to her shoulders and patted her, whispering, "Hey, wake up!" She opened her eyes and squinted, adjusting the light of the TV, wondering why I woke her up. I kept telling her to remain still and silent when I heard the sound again. She looked at me, noticed the concern in my eyes, and asked what was wrong. Putting 2 fingers on her lips and looking into her eyes, I could see she was getting freaked out, and I don't blame her. I would be too if somebody woke me up, looking scared and telling me to be quiet. The clicking sound went off again, but it was louder this time, almost as if the thing was on the other side of the window. This time both of us heard the noise, and we stood up looking at each other. "What's that?" my girlfriend asked, but I remained quiet. Again in slow motion, I started to turn my head to the window to check, and there it was. The thing was right outside the window, only a couple feet away, and staring right back at me. This time, I had a clear vision of how it looked. I was wrong. I, petrified in fear when I noticed it didn't have a mouth where a person should have it. Instead, the mouth was on its neck, which opened horizontally, not vertically. As its mouth opened, it vibrated with the clicking sounds, and hundreds of small razor-like teeth shinned with the window glare. It had an oval-shaped eyes that were as dark as the night. I felt its gaze pierce through my soul. I started shaking and breathing faster, not believing what I was seeing. My girlfriend peeked by my side to see what I was looking, and I instantly felt her body tense up under me as she started to ask me in a trembling voice what that thing was. But no answer came out of me. Now we were both scared to even move a muscle. After the humanoid noticed my girlfriend move, it gave a step forward and lowered its head, almost as if it was scanning us. We jumped in fear after seeing the thing doing it because we thought it would start coming toward us. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would faint at any time. Then, the thing began to walk slowly to its right side, in the direction where the door to the corridor was, resuming the clicking sounds. If you have seen the movie Signs and remember the scene where the humanoid came out of the bushes outside the house, that would be an accurate representation of what we saw. We took a good look at every inch of this thing's body. It walked with its head turned towards us. After we lost sight of it through the window, we both sat up and looked at each other, when suddenly we heard something scratch the metal door that led to the corridor, as if the thing was grazing its fingers. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my girlfriend's wrist and jolted out of the living room, locking ourselves in her bedroom. We sat on the floor right next to the bedroom, hiding in case that thing got inside. The scratching kept continuing, and my girlfriend began sobbing, still asking about what we saw. I felt powerless, knowing I couldn't do much to reassure her. I could only hold her and hope for the thing to give up and leave. The noise continued for about 3 minutes when it suddenly stopped. Then, we began hearing stepping noises all around the house, and we kept turning to whatever direction we heard the noises come from. Eventually, the noises ceased, and after an hour or so, we figured the creature had left. My girlfriend, still with tears in her eyes, told me if we could lay in bed. I agreed because my back was hurting from being on that couch for over an hour. We slowly crawled into bed, making the least noise possible and covering ourselves with another blanket. I didn't get a minute of sleep that night. I kept my eyes opened, listening to every sound around us. The next day, we didn't even want to touch the subject. All we said was that the creature was not from this world. My girlfriend said she felt the creature's gaze pierce into her, almost as if that thing was feeling with its pure sight. Nothing else was said, and we were left sort of traumatized. I realized that she was going to put up with that fear of going outside in the future, and I didn't want that thing anywhere near her again or her family. Days after the encounter, we both suffered from terrible nightmares. She mentioned that she sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, screaming and trembling, and wouldn't be able to stop until her mom went to check on her. The fences that separated the patio and the woods had been redone since. They now stand 2 meters tall, blocking any easy access from the woods. Before this, they had to make sure they didn't have to go outside at night. They haven't had any other encounters again, but my girlfriend insists that the patio still gives her chills at night.